During the dark times of the Third Reich, a spectre of fervor and devotion swept through the lives of German women, who, under the banner of National Socialism, were molded to serve the Führer's regime. From school classrooms to the strict formations of the Bund Deutscher Modell, these young women were indoctrinated with Aryan ideals of purity and loyalty. However, as the war progressed and the Nazi death machinery perfected itself, many of these women were dragged into much more sinister roles. Women like Irma Grese and Ilse Koch became symbols of female brutality in the service of the Third Reich. Armed with whips and an iron will, these guards coldly and precisely carried out the most atrocious orders, overseeing the suffering of thousands of prisoners in the extermination camps. The atrocities committed by these guards defied all comprehension. From sexual abuse and inhuman medical experiments to summary executions and physical and psychological torture, their cruelty knew no bounds. Join us as we explore the role of German women during the Third Reich and the part played by female guards in the infamous extermination camps. Welcome to Leonardo da Vinci's tales. Daughters of the Third Reich, the Nazi women. In the eyes of the Nazi ideology, the world revolved around men. They were those who worked, provided, and protected. They were the pillar of Nazi Germany. In such a society, women had a special role. They were expected to fulfill roles that aligned with the regime's ideology, which centered around the concept of Kinder, Küche, Kirche, children, kitchen, church. This phrase summarized the belief that a woman's primary duties were to bear children, manage the household, and uphold moral values within the family, roles that Nazis saw as vital for the survival of the nation. Organizations such as the NS Frauenschaft, the National Socialist Women's League, played a crucial role in this. It provided training and education to prepare women for their duties as wives and mothers. This training included courses on cooking, cleaning, child-rearing, and managing household finances. The structure of the NS Frauenschaft mirrored that of the Nazi Party, with leaders at various levels, regional, district, local, cell, and block, who reported to male counterparts. This structure ensured that women worked within the framework set by the male-dominated party leadership. The NS Frauenschaft played a significant role in the Gleichschaltung process, the Nazi policy of coordinating and consolidating control over all aspects of society. The organization emphasized the importance of motherhood, encouraging women to bear multiple children to strengthen the Aryan race. Training programs in the Reich Mothers Service taught women about childcare within the context of hereditary health and racial laws. Other sections, such as national economy, domestic economy, and auxiliary service, provided practical training on household management, air raid protection, and social welfare projects. These programs aimed to instill Nazi values in everyday activities, ensuring that women contributed to the regime's goals in their roles as mothers and homemakers. The NS Frauenschaft also aimed to create a sense of community among German women, promoting the concept of Volksgemeinschaft, people's community. Through neighborhood aid, women provided support to each other, especially during the war. This initiative involved helping with household tasks, childcare, and supporting families affected by bombings. The goal was to foster a spirit of cooperation and mutual aid, reinforcing the idea that the well-being of the community was paramount. However, as the economy grew and the demands of war increased, women were needed to fill gaps left by conscripted men. By the late 1930s and during World War II, many women were called back into the workforce, especially in roles that were deemed suitable for their biological nature, such as agricultural, social, or domestic work. Despite this, the regime maintained that women's primary role should be at home, caring for their families and raising children. Despite the emphasis on traditional roles, the start of the war saw a significant shift in the regime's policies towards women. As the war progressed, the need for labor increased dramatically, leading to the mobilization of women into various sectors of the industry critical to the war effort. Despite ideological concerns about women working outside the home, economic needs took precedence, and women were required to fill positions vacated by men who were conscripted into the military. This involvement was crucial to sustaining the Nazi war machine and the economy during the war years. The casualty toll of the Eastern Front altered the women's position in Nazi society even more. With every man needed at the front, their wives, sisters and girlfriends had to replace them wherever it was possible. The fatherland needed everyone to serve, even if that meant women would have to be engaged in roles that were once strictly reserved for men. As time would show, this showed that not only women were exclusively the gentler sex, but that they could be more fervent Nazis than men. Despite the clear division of roles in society into male and female, the Nazi regime insisted everyone were indoctrinated with their ideology. The primary role in creating Nazi women was played by the League of German Girls, the Bund Deutscher Mädel, BDM. By 1939, membership in the Hitler Youth, which included the BDM, was unavoidable for both boys and girls. It was expected that all young Germans join their respective organizations, where they would be indoctrinated into Nazi ideology, culture, and principles. Membership in the BDM was restricted to girls of pure Aryan descent, who had to provide proof of their ancestry. Those who met these stringent requirements swore a personal oath of allegiance to Hitler. Then they were sent to BDM training camps, highly structured and militaristic facilities. Over there, girls had to adhere to strict schedules that included exercise routines, marches, and political discussions. Girls were expected to work hard, maintain their appearance, and follow orders precisely. The BDM created a sisterhood among the girls, with a common bond of being females in the Third Reich. At the same time, it did not encourage initiative or new ideas. Education was confined to party-approved subjects, leading to a generation of semi-literate women qualified only for simple tasks. However, the cornerstone of the BDM's indoctrination was training in absolute loyalty to Adolf Hitler and the principles of National Socialism. Girls in the BDM were required to learn a wide range of subjects related to Nazi ideology. They were expected to know detailed information about Hitler, his parents, the Nazi Party, and especially Hitler's life work Mein Kampf, the Nazi Bible. Camp teachers lectured girls on the greatness of the German race. They were taught to have no compassion for the enemies of their race, with Jews being portrayed as the most severe threat to Germany's future. Fear was often used as a tool to reinforce these teachings, making the girls believe that their survival depended on the elimination of all undesirable racial elements. Daughters of Darkness, the women who fueled the Nazi regime. Paradoxically, organizations such as NS Frauenschaft and BDM became a breeding ground for women who would jump out from their traditional mother and housewife roles. Women in Nazi Germany started to play various roles that supported and sustained the vicious regime. They were involved in administrative positions, participated in state-sanctioned activities such as the Lebensborn program, contributed to the war effort, and were a part of Nazi propaganda. The Lebensborn program was one of the state-sanctioned activities in which women were heavily involved. This program aimed to increase the birth rate of Aryan children. Women were encouraged to bear children for the state, and those who did were often praised as models of fertility. The program included the establishment of Reich bride schools, which trained young women to become ideal wives for SS officers. These schools taught domestic skills, racial theory, and genetics. The young women were indoctrinated in the cult of National Socialism to serve their men and pledge allegiance to the party. Women also played a crucial role in Nazi propaganda. Magda Goebbels, the wife of Joseph Goebbels, was presented as the perfect Aryan mother and housewife in propaganda publications. Film director Leni Riefenstahl produced some of the most famous Nazi propaganda films, including Triumph of the Will. Other women, like actress Zara Leander and aviator Hannah Reich, were celebrated in Nazi propaganda for their contributions to the regime. Gertrude Schultz-Klink, leader of the Nazi Women's League, was one of the most prominent women in the Nazi regime. She was responsible for promoting Nazi ideals among German women and organizing their contributions to the state. Despite her high position, she was described as a figurehead, a mere tool of the male-dominated leadership. Schultz-Klink advocated for women to surrender their personal interests and ambitions to serve their male masters, reflecting the regime's view of women's roles. The Nazi regime manipulated and utilized women to support its goals, while denying them significant power or influence. Women were encouraged to participate in ways that reinforced traditional gender roles and supported the state's needs, whether through administrative work, participation in the Lebensborn program, contributing to the war effort, or spreading propaganda. Despite their contributions, women were ultimately kept in subordinate positions and used to further the regime's objectives without granting them real power or recognition. More influential in the functioning in the Nazi annihilation machine were women that were personally connected to male Nazi officials. These were primarily the wives of SS officers. Potential SS wives underwent a rigorous process to assess their suitability. They attended a 6-week motherhood course and had to provide evidence of an unsullied Aryan bloodline traceable through several generations. Questionnaires included questions about the bride's personality, family financial stability, and commitment to the National Socialist cause. Himmler envisioned the ideal SS soldier as a modern Siegfried, possessing virtues of Teutonic knights and being a specimen of Aryan perfection. This ideal soldier required a suitable mate to produce perfect Aryan offspring. Duties of an SS wife were clear. Although 240,000 women joined the SS by marrying one of Himmler's elite, they knew the function and duties of the SS. They were aware of the primary aim of the organization, which was to subjugate and enslave the inferior races in the occupied East. Their role in the natural hierarchy of the sexes was to provide an inner attitude to the family, uphold what the man created, and nurture future Nazi warriors. However, for some of the SS wives, this was not enough. They used their position to gratify sadistic tendencies and were sometimes even more brutal than their husbands. One such was Vera Wohlauf, a fanatical Nazi, who accompanied her husband into occupied territories to witness and participate in the oppression and extermination of the local populations. On August 25, 1942, Vera joined her husband on a delayed honeymoon. At the time, her husband, Captain Julius Wohlauf, was engaged with the Police Battalion 101 in an action to round up Polish Jews from the Miedzierzek Podlaski ghetto for transportation to Treblinka. Despite being 4 months pregnant, she accompanied her husband and even actively participated in the brutalities, showing no sympathy toward the victims. Other women present included the wives of Nazi officials and Red Cross nurses. Vera, however, was the only one who tormented the victims, walking among them with a horsewhip. Her behavior was unsettling even to the men of her husband's unit, who resented her presence. Her husband, Captain Julius Wohlauf, known as Little Rommel due to his self-importance, was not even close as anti-Semitic and sadistic as his wife. After the massacre, the battalion commander, Major Trapp, expressed disapproval of the presence of officers' wives at such operations, especially pregnant ones. He was unaware that Vera was not an innocent bystander, but an active participant in the atrocities. Despite his disapproval, Vera continued to take part in several more actions in the following weeks. She died before the war ended. Angels of Death, the Nazi women in the medical atrocities. Infused with Nazi ideology, many girls and women took active participation in the criminal activities of the regime. Like their male counterparts, they too became the ugly face of the Nazi Germany. One of the professions in which women excelled in upholding Nazi values was that of medical personnel. Female doctors and nurses played significant roles in Nazi medical programs, particularly in euthanasia and medical experiments. These women operated under a different code of ethics, prioritizing the health of the state over the care of individual patients. This code implied that unhealthy or diseased individuals were seen as burdens to be eradicated for the greater good of the Aryan race. One prominent example is Irmgard Huber, a head nurse at Hadamar, a facility where about 15,000 people were murdered by lethal injection or gassed in the basement. Huber claimed she was compelled to participate and tried to maintain a semblance of care by giving cakes to children before they were killed. Despite her apparent regret for the victims, she was involved in selecting patients for euthanasia, controlling the drugs, and falsifying death certificates. Huber was eventually prosecuted for her role, receiving a 25-year prison sentence, later extended by 8 more years by a German court. Another nurse, Pauline Kneissler, was also involved in the killings at Hadamar and was believed to have killed wounded German soldiers on the Russian front. Kneissler, known for her indifference to her patients' fates, participated in the euthanasia of nearly 10,000 patients at the Grafeneck Castle Asylum. She was responsible for selecting useless eaters to be transported and gassed. Female participation extended beyond euthanasia to medical experiments. These experiments were often conducted in concentration camps, where women were subjected to horrific treatments under the guise of medical research. Nurses assisted doctors in these experiments, which included sterilization procedures, testing the effects of various drugs, and exposing individuals to diseases to study their progression. The tragedy is that involvement of female medical professionals in these programs was not isolated to a few individuals. There was a great number of women in the nursing and medical fields who embraced the Nazi ideology, believing their actions were necessary for the state's health. Their actions were part of a broader state policy that sought to maintain the purity of the Aryan race through the elimination of those deemed unworthy of life. This belief system allowed them to reconcile their roles as caregivers with their participation in widespread murder and torture. Probably the most notorious woman known for cruel medical experiments during the Nazi era was Herta Oberhäuser. As a child, Herta displayed a wicked temper, but nothing as close as the evil she would later show. She joined the League of German Girls, BDM, and was keen on becoming a doctor from an early age. Herta graduated from medical school in Bonn in 1937, specializing in dermatology. As a medical intern, she joined the Nazi Party. Despite her qualifications, she did not have a full license to practice medicine unsupervised. In 1940, Herta became an assistant to Karl Gebhardt, the chief surgeon of the SS and Heinrich Himmler's personal physician. By 1942, she and Gebhardt were engaged in conducting experiments at the Ravensbrück concentration camp. Their experiments involved infecting wounds of inmates with objects such as wood, rusty nails, glass, soil, sawdust, and even human excrement. These infections, under the filthy conditions of the camp, often led to severe pain, pus-filled wounds, gangrene, and almost always death, without any treatment to ease the suffering. Gebhardt justified these experiments by claiming they were learning how to treat battlefield injuries. Evidently, with available antibiotics, such barbaric practices were quite unnecessary. Apart from these barbaric experiments, Gebhardt and Herta Oberhäuser also conducted experiments on bone, muscle, and nerve transplantation. As if this wasn't enough, Herta Oberhäuser extended her cruel experiments to children in the camp. She injected them with oil and Evipan, an anesthetic, then proceeded to remove their vital organs and limbs while they were still conscious. Under such conditions, children would die within 3 to 5 minutes. These experiments served no medical purpose and were purely for sadistic pleasure. Additionally, Herta injected adults and children with powdered glass, a procedure that caused extreme suffering. One victim recalled how Oberhäuser made a large incision into her leg, exposed the shin bone, and encased it in a plaster cast, forcing the victim to walk on the infected limb. All Herta Oberhäuser's medical practices were marked by a sadistic enjoyment of inflicting pain. She often removed skin blemishes like moles and birthmarks without any anesthesia. After the war, Herta Oberhäuser ended up at the Nuremberg doctor's trial. Amazingly, she escaped the death penalty and was sentenced to 20 years in prison, reduced to 5 years due to time served. After her release in 1952, she resumed practicing as a doctor until her medical license was revoked. She lived in obscurity until her death in 1978. Karl Gebhardt, her superior, was hanged for war crimes and crimes against humanity in 1948. The 35 women who survived the experiments carried out by Oberhäuser and Gebhardt endured lifelong pain and disability. Many could not understand how Oberhäuser avoided the death penalty. It was a justified penalty for her actions that demonstrated that evil was not confined to men alone. Despite appearing ordinary, Herta Oberhäuser became a symbol of the extreme cruelty of Nazi medical personnel. Queens of cruelty, the female guards of Nazi concentration camps. However hard it is to imagine, atrocities committed by the Nazi female medical personnel were nowhere near to the horrors of the female concentration camp guards. In the beginning, the role of a camp guard was reserved exclusively for men. Many of the German women who entered the Nazi concentration camp system did so to fill gaps caused by manpower shortages as more men were required to fight on various fronts. It is important, however, to note that women filled these roles without coercion. They were motivated by a sense of duty to the Reich. These women primarily came from the lower classes of German society. They included hairdressers, hospital matrons, tramcar conductresses, retired teachers, and others. They were recruited via advertisements in newspapers which often carried the headline, "Show your love for the Reich," appealing specifically to women. Once again, the BDM was instrumental in breeding an army of ruthless and senseless females. Through their indoctrination program, BDM instructors taught teenage girls and young women to feel no pity, remorse, or compassion for those under their control within the concentration camps. Some volunteered full of enthusiasm, only to be crushed by the experience. They could not bear the sight of children being led to certain death in the gas chambers. To thrive in such an environment required a particularly hard, dedicated, and ruthless individual. There were several death camps in which women served as guards, the so-called Aufseherins. Most notable of these were Auschwitz-Birkenau, Ravensbrück, Majdanek, Bergen-Belsen, and Sobibor. In these camps, SS men occupied all the senior posts, with women employed as guards and were subordinate to them. Himmler did not tolerate admitting women to the SS, but once the war was underway, he finally agreed to compromise by granting them admission as SS auxiliaries, Gefolge. The paradox is, most of the female camp personnel were volunteers and claimed to have no particular political affiliation or interest, and many were not even party members. They were almost all single women who had been attracted by the prospect of a secure job with reasonable pay, free accommodation, regular meals, and the possibility of advancement in the ranks. Few had any professional or academic qualifications, and almost all of them came from the lower social classes, with no prospect of better wages or job security in the outside world. Their lack of education and disadvantaged backgrounds made them, in some extreme cases, vindictive, so they were more prone to take out their frustration on the powerless women in their charge. Conditions in the camps were extremely harsh. Sanitation facilities and hygiene were crude, and the overcrowded, unheated living conditions were unfit even for animals. The women were packed into battery hens-like barracks, where disease ran unchecked and was even seen as a convenient means of singling out those unfit for work. Those who were not eliminated by diseases had to survive thirst, hypothermia, and malnutrition. The rest were murdered, executed by hanging, lethal injection, gas, or shot to death in the narrow alley known as the shooting gallery. The largest concentration camp specifically for women was Ravensbrück, which served as a model for the women's camp at Auschwitz. It was initially constructed to hold 5,000 prisoners, but was soon expanded to 40 subcamps containing 45,000 prisoners. With the overcrowding came a marked deterioration in living conditions and an increase in executions and random killings. In April 1941, a separate camp for teenage girls categorized as delinquents was opened at Uckermark. There were also an estimated 800 children living behind the barbed wire, some born in the camp. The camp was also a breeding ground for some of the most ruthless female guards in Nazi Germany, women credited for diabolical things a normal mind could hardly imagine. Herta Botha, the brutal guardian of Nazi concentration camps. One of them was Herta Botha, born on January 8, 1921, in Tetterow, Mecklenburg. Herta grew up during the rise of the Nazi Party and was exposed to its ideologies. She had limited education and might have faced literacy issues. Initially, she worked in various jobs, including as a domestic worker, before deciding to train as a nurse. However, her nursing training was brief, and soon she saw working for the SS in the camp structure as a chance for improving her socio-economic status. In late 1942, Botha was conscripted to work as an Aufseherin at Ravensbrück. During her guards career, she worked in Stutthof, Bromberg, and ultimately reached Bergen-Belsen. At Bergen-Belsen, Botha supervised about 60 prisoners, both male and female, who were used for slave labor in the Wood Commando, the department assigned to gather, chop, and transport wood. Botha's duties included ensuring wood was delivered to the kitchen and other areas of the camp. She shared sleeping quarters with other female guards. Several survivors recounted that Botha beat inmates with her fists and pieces of wood for minor infractions, such as stealing scraps of food or wood. She admitted to slapping prisoners, but denied using extreme force or objects other than her hands. Despite this, many survivors testified that she inflicted severe beatings. At her trial, which began on September 17, 1945, and lasted until November 17, 1945, Botha insisted that she only followed orders and did not always report prisoners' actions, instead opting to slap them herself. One survivor alleged that Botha beat a Hungarian Jew named Eva to death with a block of wood. Despite her claims at trial that she never carried weapons, numerous survivors testified that Botha shot at prisoners for sport while they were carrying their food rations. Botha's defense attorney argued that she was young and had grown up under the Nazi regime, thus not entirely responsible for her actions. He maintained that Botha could not be compared to other guards who were directly responsible for murders. Ultimately, Botha was found guilty of committing war crimes at Bergen-Belsen and sentenced to 10 years in prison, but was released after serving only 6 years in December 1951. Later in life, Botha gave interviews discussing her time in the camps, denying full responsibility for her actions and claiming she would have been a prisoner herself if she had not acted as she did. She died in 2000 with absolute lack of remorse for things she did. Ilse Koch, the Witch of Buchenwald. Another Officerherrin, Ilse Koch, known as the Witch of Buchenwald, was notorious for her extreme cruelty towards prisoners. As the wife of Karl Otto Koch, the commandant of Buchenwald concentration camp, she had a powerful and feared presence in the camp. Ilse Koch was not just a guard, she was a symbol of terror for the inmates. Ilse Koch's treatment of prisoners was a true example of sadism and brutality. She often rode her horse through the camp carrying a whip. As she rode, she would lash out at prisoners, whipping them without any provocation. This act alone instilled fear among the inmates, as they never knew when or why she might strike. One of the most horrifying accusations against Ilse Koch was her alleged practice of selecting prisoners based on their tattoos. She had a particular interest in unique and decorative tattoos. Prisoners with such tattoos were singled out, and their fates were grim. These prisoners were killed, and their tattooed skin was removed. The skin was then supposedly used to make lampshades, book covers, and other items. This gruesome practice earned her the nickname the Witch of Buchenwald. Ilse Koch was also known for her psychological torment of prisoners by forcing them to perform humiliating and degrading tasks. For example, she would make prisoners kneel and bark like dogs, mocking them and taking pleasure in their humiliation. Her actions were designed to break the spirit of the prisoners and assert her dominance over them. In one instance, a survivor recounted how Ilse Koch ordered a group of prisoners to dig a large pit. After the pit was dug, she made them fill it back in, only to order them to dig it again. This pointless and exhausting exercise was another form of psychological torture, demonstrating her power to make prisoners perform meaningless labor at her whim. When she was bored, Ilse would often call prisoners to her office under the pretense of needing assistance, only to abuse them. Her unpredictable behavior meant that prisoners never knew what to expect, adding to their constant state of fear and anxiety. Ilse Koch's trial after the war brought to light many of these atrocities. As expected, Ilse Koch denied her involvement in any acts of cruelty. She portrayed herself as a victim of false accusations, claiming she was simply a wife following her husband's orders. However, the testimonies of the survivors were overwhelming. They depicted her as an active and willing participant in the horrors of Buchenwald. Although the US Military Commission Court initially sentenced Ilse Koch to life imprisonment, her sentence was reduced to only 4 years. It was a decision that caused a public outbreak. Unfortunately, for Ilse, the same day she was released from prison in 1949, she was arrested by German authorities. In a whole new trial, she was again sentenced to life imprisonment. Koch hanged herself at Aichach Women's Prison on the 1st of September 1967 at age 60. In her last days, she had delusions that the camp survivors would come to her cell to abuse her. Irma Grese, the hyena of Auschwitz. Irma Grese was one of the most infamous guards of Nazi concentration camps, known for her extreme cruelty and sadistic behavior. Born on October 7, 1923, in Reich, near Mecklenburg, Germany, she grew up in a farm-working family. Her mother committed suicide when Irma was 12, which likely had a significant impact on her. By her teenage years, she was deeply influenced by Nazi propaganda. Despite father's disapproval, she was determined to join the Nazi organizations. At the age of 15, Irma left school and started looking for jobs. Although she worked as a dairy farmhand and shop girl, she really wanted to be a nurse. Ultimately, she ended up working as a nurse's aide at Hohenleichen Hospital, where she witnessed vivisections on prisoners from Ravensbrück. Contact with Nazi Dr. Karl Gebhardt helped Irma get a job as an Aufseherin at Ravensbrück concentration camp. Despite her later claims of being conscripted, it was evident she volunteered for the position. Grese began her training as an Aufseherin in the summer of 1942 and was soon recognized for her potential by higher-ranking officials. Her rise in the SS hierarchy was swift, and by 1943 she was employed at Auschwitz-Birkenau, supervising thousands of female prisoners. At Auschwitz, Irma Grese quickly became known for her relentless and violent treatment of prisoners. She regularly carried a whip, which she used to beat inmates mercilessly. Her victims were often young women, whom she targeted with particular cruelty. Grese's beatings were brutal and unprovoked, and she seemed to derive great satisfaction from the suffering she inflicted. Prisoners lived in constant fear of her unpredictable and savage outbursts. Grese enjoyed psychological torment as well. She forced prisoners to stand for hours in the freezing cold, knowing that many would suffer severe frostbite or even die from exposure. These methods were designed to push the victims to the brink of despair and break their spirits. Such a ruthless behavior earned her the nickname, the hyena of Auschwitz. One of the most horrifying aspects of Grese's cruelty was her involvement in medical experiments. She worked closely with Nazi doctors as a person responsible for selecting prisoners for their experiments. She often chose those who were already weak or ill. These victims were then subjected to agonizing and often deadly treatments, and Grese showed no remorse for their suffering. Her participation in these experiments highlighted her complete disregard for human life. In the same manner, Grese had an active role in the selection process for executions. She would coldly and methodically choose prisoners to be sent to the gas chambers or subjected to other forms of execution. When she was transferred to Bergen-Belsen, Grese continued with her brutality. This camp was known for its horrific conditions, and Grese's actions only added to the prisoners' misery. She continued to beat and torture inmates, showing no compassion even as the camp descended into chaos. Survivors of Bergen-Belsen recounted how Grese would unleash her dogs on prisoners, watching with satisfaction as the animals attacked defenseless people. She seemed to take perverse pleasure in seeing the prisoners suffer. When the British liberated Bergen-Belsen, Grese was arrested along with other camp personnel. During her trial, many witnesses came forward to testify against her, describing in detail the horrors they had endured under her rule. Amazingly, Grese attempted to justify her actions by blaming the prisoners for provoking her. She showed no remorse, insisting that her brutal measures were necessary to maintain order. The night before her execution, she spent singing Nazi songs with another Aufseherin, Johanna Bormann. Grese's actions during her time as an Aufseherin made her one of the most feared and despised figures in the Nazi concentration camps. Johanna Bormann, the Beast of Bergen-Belsen. Her prison inmate, Johanna Bormann, was born on the 10th of September 1893 in Birkenfelde, East Prussia. She never married. At her trial, Bormann stated she worked for the SS to make more money, but it seemed she was also very lonely and embittered. Bormann was over 50 when she was arrested. She was not attractive and did not fit the Nazi feminine ideal. Before becoming a guard, Bormann worked at an insane asylum, making only 20 marks per month. In March 1938, she joined the SS as a civilian employee to increase her income. She made over 150 marks per month working in the camps. Johanna Bormann started at Ravensbrück as a kitchen helper and later became an Aufseherin. On the 15th of May 1943, she was assigned to Auschwitz, where she likely took part in selections for Dr. Josef Mengele, although she denied this at her trial. She was later sent to Birkenau and then to Budi, an Auschwitz subcamp. Johanna Bormann's treatment of prisoners was marked by extreme cruelty and brutality. She gained a reputation as one of the most feared guards in the concentration camps where she served. Her methods of punishment and torture were both physical and psychological, making her one of the most hated figures among the inmates. Bormann often used her large dog as an instrument of terror. Survivors recounted numerous instances where she set her dog on prisoners, causing severe injuries and, in some cases, death. The mere presence of Bormann and her dog was enough to instill fear among the inmates. She would unleash her dog on prisoners for various reasons, including minor infractions or simply to assert her dominance. One particularly harrowing account involved Bormann setting her dog on an 18-year-old inmate named Regina. The dog attacked Regina viciously, tearing apart her legs. Regina's wounds were left untreated, which led to severe infections and her eventual death. Another survivor recounted how Bormann set her dog on a menstruating prisoner during a roll call, a particularly cruel act given the vulnerability and pain the prisoner would have already been experiencing. It was not only with the help of her dog that Bormann terrorized prisoners. She frequently beat prisoners with a rubber truncheon or her fists. Survivors testified that she often targeted women for minor offenses, such as stealing a scrap of food or failing to perform tasks to her satisfaction. These beatings were so brutal that in many instances she knocked out prisoners' teeth. Bormann denied these accusations at her trial, claiming she only slapped prisoners lightly, but survivor testimonies painted a different picture. One of the milder forms of punishment was forcing the prisoners to perform exhausting exercises for hours on end, without any provocation. This treatment was particularly harsh on already weak and malnourished inmates. Bormann seemed to take pleasure in the suffering of her victims, often smiling or laughing as she inflicted pain. Bormann also participated in the selection process at Auschwitz, though she denied it during her trial. Selections were a grim procedure where prisoners were chosen for immediate execution or for medical experiments. Bormann's involvement in these selections added to her notoriety among the inmates, as being chosen often meant a death sentence or a fate equally horrific. The British captured Bormann in April 1945. She was forced to help remove bodies from lorries into mass graves before being transferred to prison. At the trial, the prosecution provided evidence of Bormann's beatings and involvement in selections. Her defense counsel argued that witnesses exaggerated claims against Bormann and her dog. He stated that Bormann only worked for the SS because she needed more money and a sense of belonging. He also argued that Bormann, being slight and frail, could not have beaten prisoners as alleged. Despite the defense's arguments, Bormann was found guilty of war crimes at Auschwitz. She was sentenced to death by hanging. Bormann was moved to a prison in Hameln, Germany, to await execution. As mentioned, the night before her death, she stayed up singing Nazi songs with other female Nazi criminals. Bormann was executed on the 13th of December 1945. The fate of her dog is unknown. Hildegard Lachert, the blood-stained mistress of Ravensbrück. The list of Aufseherins from hell continues with Hildegard Lachert, born on February 19, 1920, was an illegitimate child of a metal worker. Lachert's early life was marked by her involvement with Nazi women's organizations. She applied for the role of an Aufseherin in late 1941 or early 1942, likely through an advertisement or a friend. Lachert's first assignment was at Ravensbrück, but she was soon transferred to Auschwitz. By 1944, she had moved to Majdanek, where she earned the nickname Bloody Bridget for her extreme cruelty. Survivors described Lachert as a sadist who took pleasure in inflicting pain. She enjoyed conducting appel or roll calls with a terrifying harshness. These roll calls were often accompanied by physical punishments if she felt prisoners were not behaving as she expected. She ordered what she called sport, which were grueling exercises designed to exhaust the inmates. These activities included running, squatting, and other physically demanding tasks that could last for hours. One of her most notorious methods of punishment was whipping. Lachert carried a whip and used it frequently, striking prisoners across their faces and bodies until they bled. She seemed to derive satisfaction from seeing the pain and blood of her victims. Her use of a whip was so frequent and severe that it became one of her defining characteristics in the eyes of the survivors. Lachert, too, used her dog as a tool of terror. She trained her dog to attack prisoners on her command. The mere sight of Lachert approaching with her dog was enough to instill fear in the inmates, as they knew the animal could be set upon them at any moment. The dog attacks were brutal and could cause severe injuries or even death. Her cruelty extended to the youngest and most vulnerable prisoners. Witnesses recounted how Lachert would throw children into trucks, handling them with a complete disregard for their safety. Like most of the cruelest Aufseherins, she participated in the selection process. Survivors later testified that she seemed to take particular pleasure in sending Jewish children to the gas chambers. Lachert was first tried by the Polish government at the Auschwitz trials in 1947. She denied all charges, claiming she was forced to act under orders. Despite her defense, she was sentenced to 15 years in prison. She was retried at the third Majdanek trial from 1975 to 1981, where she was found guilty of being an accomplice to the murders of dozens and for taking part in selections. During the process, Lachert even ran for the European elections on the list of a German right-wing extremist party. Responding to accusations, she lamented on her time spent in the concentration camps, which she described as extremely dirty during rains. Ultimately, Lachert was sentenced to 12 years in prison. Since she already served 15, she was set free. Hildegard Lachert, whom the concentration camp prisoners described as the most brutal Aufseherin, died in 1995, unmolested for the gruesome things she did. Elisabeth Volkenrath, the executioner of Auschwitz. The number of women who committed most diabolical things during the Third Reich was pretty long. Another one of them was Elisabeth Volkenrath, born on September 5, 1919, in Schönau, near Bad Landeck, Silesia. She married at 20 to a man who worked for the SS. Before the war, she worked as a hairdresser in a beauty shop. In 1939, she was called up for national service and worked in a munitions factory. Then, in 1941, she was conscripted to work for the SS and was sent to train as an Aufseherin at Ravensbrück. At Ravensbrück, she received training in prisoner control, where she was instructed to use any means necessary to subdue prisoners. She stated that she never actually became a member of the SS, but wore the uniform and supervised concentration camps. Her first assignment was also at Ravensbrück, where she was responsible for preventing prisoners from escaping. In March 1942, she was sent to Auschwitz I, where she supervised prisoners in the tailor workroom and later handled the distribution of packages and bread at Birkenau. In 1943, Volkenrath was transferred back to Auschwitz I and remained there until January 1945, when she was sent to Bergen-Belsen. In this camp, she held several positions, including Aufseherin, Rapportführerin, report leader, and finally Oberaufseherin, supervising several Aufseherinnen. At Auschwitz, Volkenrath's role involved direct supervision of prisoners. She was notorious for her harsh and violent methods of maintaining order. Josephine Singer, a survivor, testified that she witnessed Volkenrath throw a woman down a flight of stairs. It was an act of violence that showed that Elisabeth had no regard for human life. Singer also witnessed that Volkenrath was always beating prisoners with her fists, inflicting them serious injuries. Lydia Sunshine, another Auschwitz survivor, described how Volkenrath would patrol the parcel department, where she was responsible for overseeing the distribution of packages to prisoners. Sunshine recounted instances when Volkenrath accused prisoners of stealing and responded by beating them severely. Sunshine admitted she did not initially know Volkenrath's name, but recognized her face as that of a brutal overseer. There were numerous testimonies of Volkenrath's cruelty, describing how she would enter the prisoner barracks without warning, confiscate food and clothing, and beat the inmates. Volkenrath also had a habit of pulling prisoners' hair and slapping them without provocation. Hilda Loftier, another survivor, confirmed these accounts, adding that Volkenrath's abuse often led to deaths. Loftier mentioned that Volkenrath would starve prisoners as punishment, causing them to die slowly and painfully. A particularly harrowing incident described by the camp survivors tells of a sick prisoner who was caught stealing vegetables. Volkenrath forced the prisoner to kneel for hours, holding the stolen vegetables above her head. When the prisoner could no longer maintain the position due to exhaustion, Volkenrath became enraged and beat her severely. The prisoner was left lying immobile for hours after the beating. Niger also witnessed Volkenrath whipping prisoners with sticks for minor infractions, such as leaving their coats undone. Alexandra Sewidowska, another eyewitness, described how Volkenrath would beat prisoners to death with various objects, including rubber truncheons. Sewidowska testified that she saw Volkenrath beat women into unconsciousness on numerous occasions. Edith Trieger's testimony corroborated Sewidowska's, highlighting Volkenrath's propensity for extreme violence. Elizabeth Volkenrath's cruelty extended beyond physical beatings. She also participated in what was referred to as making sport, a euphemism for forcing prisoners to engage in strenuous physical exercises as punishment. These exercises were often physically exhausting and designed to break the prisoners' spirits. Volkenrath was known to supervise and participate in these activities, ensuring that the prisoners suffered. As one might expect, Volkenrath was involved in the selections for the gas chambers. Despite her denials during her trial, numerous witnesses testified that she played an active role in selecting prisoners for extermination. Volkenrath was arrested by the British when Bergen-Belsen was liberated in April 1945. She was charged with war crimes at both Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen. Her trial began on September 17, 1945, and ended on November 17, 1945. Volkenrath denied most allegations, claiming she was only following orders and was often sick. Despite her defense, she was found guilty and sentenced to death by hanging. On the eve of her execution, Volkenrath was part of the gang of Aufseherins that sang Nazi songs. They all died on December 13, 1945, by the hand of the famous British executioner Albert Pierrepoint and buried in the courtyard of Hameln prison. Maria Mandl, the she-wolf of Auschwitz. Maria Mandl was too one of the most infamous female guards in the Nazi concentration camp system. Born on January 10, 1912, in Münzkirchen, Upper Austria, Mandl joined the Nazi Party in 1938 at the age of 26. By that time, she was a young, self-conscious woman. The same year, she started working in the concentration camp. Before this, she worked as an office clerk. Described as tall, blonde, and impeccable, Mandl had a fanatical admiration for beauty and music. But despite her seemingly refined tastes, she was a beast notorious for extreme brutality. Mandl began her training as an Aufseherin and was first assigned to Lichtenberg concentration camp. By May 1939, she moved to Ravensbrück, and then in 1942 to Auschwitz-Birkenau. At Auschwitz, she had at least 2 lovers and kept a horse for her pleasure. Mandl's cruelty was well documented by survivors, who described her as a demon, equally as cruel as any male SS officer. Mandl was known for her brutal physical assaults on prisoners. She had a particular way of striking women that was intended to cause maximum pain and suffering. The first blow she delivered often caused the victim's nose to bleed, and she was capable of shattering a prisoner's jaw with a single punch. These attacks were not just a means of punishment, but also a way to assert her dominance and instill fear among the inmates. Mandl's psychological cruelty was as relentless as was the physical. She treated prisoners as mere numbers, stripping them of their humanity and individuality. Daily, she and other SS women would remind the prisoners that they were nothing more than slaves, with no hope of returning to their homes or being remembered by anyone. What was distinctive for Mandl was that she enjoyed exercising her power in the most arbitrary and capricious ways. If a prisoner dared to look at her and she perceived it as an insult, that prisoner would disappear, often never to be seen again. Her whims dictated the fate of many, and no one was safe from her wrath. She too used dogs to torment the prisoners, but in a particular manner. She would set her dogs on prisoners and force them to run toward an electrified fence to escape from being attacked and slaughtered. Those who managed to reach the fence were killed by electricity. One particularly horrifying aspect of Mandl's treatment of prisoners was her involvement in the selections at Auschwitz. She played a direct role in deciding who would live and who would be sent to the gas chambers. Survivors recounted how Mandl took part in gruesome inspections, where camp doctors would search the vaginas of young women for hidden valuables or signs of pregnancy, both of which could lead to immediate execution. Mandl took a perverse pleasure in these inspections, and she was notably pleased when discovering that one young girl was a virgin. Mandl's cruelty knew no boundaries and extended to children as well. She had a habit of adopting Jewish children for short periods, treating them well for a few days before sending them to their deaths. One chilling account involved a Polish toddler who arrived at the camp with his mother. Mandel took the child, lavished him with attention and treats for a week, and then coldly delivered him to the gas chamber. Mandel's contradictory nature was evident in her interactions with older prisoners as well. While she often displayed extreme cruelty, she occasionally showed acts of kindness, like giving extra rations or food to prisoners. Mandel was deeply attached to Alma Rose, the conductor of the women's orchestra. When Rose died, Mandel openly mourned her. It was an extremely rare display of emotion for an SS officer. However, this momentary glimpse of humanity did not absolve her of her crimes. Also, sentiment toward Rose probably had to do with Mandel's love for the music. She was in charge of the camp's women's orchestra, but even in this role, Mandel showed the twisted complexity of her character. She would gather the orchestra for occasions of mass murdering and sending the prisoners to gas chambers. Musicians were forced to play while they watched dozens of people being killed just a few feet away. Killings were committed. Mandel used the music, which could have been a source of solace, as yet another tool in her arsenal of cruelty. It served to calm prisoners before they were subjected to brutality. In the spring of 1944, Mandel received the Military Cross of Merit Second Class for her service to the Nazi state. Later that year, she was sent to a subcamp of Dachau, and then went on the run in May 1945 when Allied soldiers approached the camp. She was arrested by American soldiers and handed over to the Polish authorities for trial. Mandel was tried for war crimes and crimes against humanity by the Polish Supreme National Tribunal. Despite her defense team's attempts to portray her as a simple individual following orders, eyewitness testimony and her own actions proved otherwise. Mandel was found guilty and sentenced to death by hanging. She was executed on January 18, 1948. Monstrous minds, the women who embodied Nazi evil. Series of trials conducted after the war, which lasted until the early 80s, shocked the world with facts about diabolical things women committed in service of the Nazi monstrous regime. In a traditionalistic society where men presented the strong pillars of the society and women were seen as a fragile and gentler sex, it was particularly hard to imagine the deeds described by the survivors of death camps. Naturally, people as well as the scientific community started asking questions why they did it. Were they persons with disturbed mental health? And if not, what was their motivation to commit such monstrous things? Nazi female guards, for example, maltreated prisoners for several reasons. One key reason was the belief in Aryan biological superiority, which was central to Nazi ideology. This belief led to a sense of natural supremacy, though it alone does not explain the sadistic behavior of many women. Some women became hardened criminals capable of horrific acts simply because they had the opportunity to do so. They made a deliberate decision to abuse helpless prisoners, which was only exacerbated by the environment and the ideology they were immersed in. Truth be told, the violence committed by these women was not exclusively connected to their Nazi background. Throughout history, many women did similar things, especially those in power. Examples include Boudica, a warrior queen of the Iceni people who massacred 70,000 Romans in East Anglia, Catherine de' Medici, French queen blamed for the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, where thousands of French Protestants were killed, or Queen Mary I of England, known as Bloody Mary. All of these women used violence as means to achieve their goals, and because they were rulers, they were allowed to do so. In the same manner, women in Nazi camps acted out of a sense of opportunity and power, using their roles to exert control and inflict pain on prisoners. Interestingly, the psychological profiles of these women did not show inherent sadism or a propensity for violence. Instead, many were ordinary individuals who became capable of extreme cruelty in the context of their environment, in which constant propaganda and indoctrination played a significant role. These women were convinced that their actions were justified, and the Nazi regime created an environment where violence against designated enemies was even encouraged and rewarded. Nazi propaganda presented Jews and other undesirables as threats to the Aryan race, fostering hatred and fear among the German population, including women. This indoctrination led many Aufseherins to believe that their violent actions were necessary and justified. There was also a fear of being seen as an enemy of the state if they did not conform, which also pressured women to participate in the violence. On the other hand, women who worked for the SS were rewarded for their cruelty. Such constant reinforcement of violence as means to achieve goals of the Nazi regime led many women to commit heinous acts. Even women who initially did not exhibit violent tendencies became capable of extreme cruelty in the context of the Nazi society. Ultimately, we come to the conclusion that Nazi regime's propaganda, indoctrination, and environment played important roles in shaping the behavior of women monsters. In combination with personal choice, opportunity, and a supportive environment for violence, it led many women to become perpetrators of some of the most diabolical crimes in human history.